Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Oddity, Post-Literacy and Chris Nolan's Trojan Horse. Songs will be all they have to remember those of us who could write. Travis Scott. It is impossible for us to relive or feel the inner spirit of the ancient Greeks. The sculptor's attempts to employ Greek principles can only achieve a similarity in form, while the work itself remains for all time without a soul. Such imitation resembles the antics of apes. Externally, the animal's movements are almost like those of human beings. The monkey sits and holds a book an inch from its nose, turns the pages, makes thoughtful faces, but there is no sense or meaning in any of these actions. With cold eyes and indifferent spirit, the spectator regards this work. The connoisseurs admire skill, just as one would admire the prowess of a tightrope dancer, and enjoy the painting as one would enjoy a pastry. Hungry souls leave as hungry as they came. Hi everybody, and as you can see from the title, the Trojan Horse is the theme I wanted to look at. And don't worry, for those of you suffering from Christopher Nolan fatigue, I'm actually not going to talk about the intricacies of the film The Odyssey. I'm much more interested in the notion of what a Trojan horse is, more metaphorically, how it works to affect people when they're watching or reading or experiencing a type of art, but the medium. The concept of the medium is the message I'll talk about in a second. But the idea that irrespective of within film terms whether it's a good movie or not, that's a separate question. I'm not looking at that today. I want to look at the peculiarities, the specifics of film, and how that affects our relationship to reading. So, for example, you can, in a certain sense, you can read the meaning of a movie, as loads of people are currently doing online. There's been a complete, feeding frenzy about the significance of what Christopher Nolan's doing and what it all means. But beyond that, I think it's not truly reading. It's not the same type of reading that you do with a genuine literary text. And that distinction, the way in which the movie uses a classical epic poem form and does something with it, that what it does with it is what I want to look at, and the significance of what it does to it. And just to repeat, so no one criticizes me for being anti-Christopher Nolan, whatever, it's perfectly possible, I'm parking my judgment to one side, whether The Odyssey is a good film or not. What I'm talking about is, how does it affect the person viewing the film in a society in which conventional, old-fashioned reading and writing is on a complete downward trend? And are things happening when you watch the film, or is the making of the film about one of the most famous and oldest stories ever told? What does that reveal about our society? So I'm asking bigger questions, bigger themes. So please don't, help me to just go beyond obsessing about particular features of the film. One interesting aspect, though, is to talk about the difference between bigger issues and smaller issues. People have picked up on the various anachronisms in the film. So I'll show you in a second, there's the Viking longboat that's actually in the film. It's a real Viking reconstruction of a Viking longboat that's very accurate. But that's, I think, about 2,000 years out of date compared to when the Odyssey would have been written from the original oral epic. So Christopher Nolan's wanted the physical accuracy of a similar type of boat, so he could film certain scenes at sea and they would look realistic. But he's been completely prepared to deal with the anachronism of it's just the wrong era of ship. Now, certain people have got, quite offended by that or upset by that. There's also, I'm just thinking of other anachronisms. There's the weird armour. There's the Iron Age giants wearing, silvery metal when in fact this is supposed to be the Bronze Age that's being depicted. So there are various technical anachronisms, which maybe another time, but people can discuss this ad nauseum, ad infinitum on the internet. I want to point to a bigger anachronism. Given that we're living in an increasingly post-literate society, that begs the question, what are the unique features of literacy? And I'm going to be guiding you through some broad ideas, because this could turn into, it started off as one video and it's already morphed into 3 or 4 separate themes. But for example, the oral telling of the original epic, the way they were recited, that was a very unique form of telling a story that we tend to think, again, anachronistically, we think of it as a form of literature. I'm going to be describing very shortly the way in which actually it was almost a form of religion. It was a form of incantation when the so-called singer, they were known as, told the story. The bard would tell the story. And that is not how we understand a narrative. So right from the get-go, if you actually go back to the roots of Homer's story, it's instructive, even though we can't go back, as that epigraph, the quote I opened with about we just act like apes if we actually try and get inside the head totally of an ancient Greek person. But that doesn't stop us from trying to understand, at least somewhat, the difference between an ancient Greek person's experience of Homer's story and ours. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, someone like Christopher Nolan's not perfectly entitled to do whatever he wants to the original, adapt it in so many different ways. For some people, he's doing violence to the original story. For others, it's very creative and imaginative. That's not my point. My point is, when you adapt something, to what extent are you still aware of the difference in the adaptation? Not even at just the textual level, so, different things are said, but the fundamental experience of the story being told and how it's told and the medium through which it's told. If it's done in a completely new way, it strikes me that it would be much more useful and helpful if you were aware of the differences so that you can then judge what you're watching in the round. Whereas the Trojan Horse I'm talking about, I think Christopher Nolan slips into the film like a Trojan horse, a uncritical, unreflexive way of experiencing Homer's story that is vastly different to the original. And again, that's not necessarily a problem, except if people are unaware of that and people are consuming it uncritically. I am arguing the overall argument of the video is this contributes to this post-literate age we live in. And post-literacy, the idea that we've stopped having a certain reading ability, I think is one of the most important questions of our modern times, but it doesn't get an awful lot of recognition. And you might think, well, that's odd, lots of global issues that are much more important than literacy. And one of the counter-arguments is, there's never been so much text flying around. People are reading more than ever, and that is completely true. There is more text, just like there are more photographs than there have ever been before in human history. The question is different, though. It's not just about the most basic form of literacy, the most basic form of reading. That has indisputably, on a societal level, increased. The type of reading I'm talking about is reading that is more critical, reflexive. It's an engagement with a type of art form. And in our society, that type of more proactive, active reading, the ability to interpret, the ability to appreciate nuance and subtlety, these are the things that are going by the wayside. And I'm going to suggest that the way in which Christopher Nolan has addressed Homer's epic, as far as I can see, has contributed to this. Well, it actually reflects the post-literate world. And then you get into loads of wheels within wheels. I've never been a conspiracy theorist, But I am intrigued to what extent he's not a stupid man, Christopher Nolan, and to what extent, even if he didn't mean it, I think the film can be seen almost as a pastiche of modern values and how they differ so radically from Homer's time. To fully appreciate that, you have to be familiar with Homer's original epic. And it's been reassuring. I've watched an awful lot of videos on YouTube of various people responding to Christopher Nolan's film. And a lot of them seem to have a really good knowledge and engagement with the original Homer's text, which is reassuring. You just think in this day and age, not many people would read it at all. And in that sense, what goes on online often gets a bad name. But there's a diversity of opinion online that isn't reflected in the almost overwhelming positivity of all the critics. So when I last looked, I think Rotten Tomatoes the critics was 98%. Thought it was absolutely wonderful. And again, you don't have to be a Christopher Nolan critic to when you look at the overwhelming positivity of the mainstream media's reviews. It just strikes me that there is almost this "it's too big to fail" atmosphere around it. And it's interesting that the internet, the online world, actually has provided some type of corrective towards that. Now, and at least one review I've seen, there's, what's his name? Michael Knowles is a conservative American presenter, and he did a very interesting review of the film in which he argues it's almost verging on conspiracy theory, but he actually thinks to some extent, whether knowingly or not, Christopher Nolan has presented he's done everything a real Odysseus. If you think the Odysseus, the character, if he really existed, he would be cunning, he would be deceitful, and if he really wanted an Oscar, he would produce a film like this. So it's almost like a double bluff. Christopher Nolan is acting in a true Odysseus-type style. The other thing I'd quickly mention before I move on is I remember reading an article about, they were trying to film, I think it was Crime and Punishment in St. Petersburg years ago. And as you can imagine, when you do any type of filming, it's very expensive, the amount of money that's sunk into the production. And they were trying to do a scene in the street, and there was a babushka, a little old Russian granny, up in one of the flats in these apartment blocks, banging pots and pans as loud as she could to disrupt the filming. And they sent someone up to ask her, what's going on, why are you doing this? And she said, it is the people's Dostoevsky. You shouldn't be filming it. And even I just find that really refreshing that someone could feel that strongly about literature. And I understand the Greeks haven't been too happy about what Christopher Nolan's done with the Odyssey. But largely, we don't live in a literate enough time for most people to be that exercised by the whole thing. And then the one final thing I'll say in the preamble, very long preamble at the moment, is Hannah Arendt, German theorist, once said, I'm trying to remember, was the essay Culture and Society? But the phrase, I've always loved this and I've repeated it a few times on the channel, but she said, a great work of art or literature can survive centuries of oblivion or neglect, but it's an open question as to whether it can survive an entertaining version of what it has to say. And I think that really does apply. I've seen people, so on the negative side of the Christopher Nolan film, I've seen some people say Homer's survived, invasions, the decline of various civilizations, 2 world wars, but he hasn't survived Christopher Nolan. So take that, with a pinch of salt. But I was going to talk about the Trojan Horse. This is just out of interest. Çanakkale, I think, is the Çanakkale. It's a small port southwest of Istanbul, and this is the statue they have in honor of the Trojan Horse, which I think is quite stunningly beautiful. And then I just wanted to throw this out there. It was an interesting little tangential detail I came across. This is a recreation of a Phoenician ship at I think the ships were at Byblos, was the name of the original city, Phoenician city. I think it's modern-day Lebanon. And the founding date of this city was 2750 BC. But what's interesting is you can see the prow, the horse's head. And the Greek word for horse is hippos. So the Greeks used the word hippos to describe these type of boats, which, even though they weren't Greek, the Phoenicians were merchants who covered a lot of the Mediterranean. So the Greeks would have traded with them. And it's just possible, the idea that the Trojan horse could have been it's grown up through history as a misunderstanding. They might possibly have been referring to the concept of a boat rather than an actual model horse. So it was a wooden horse, and that was reinterpreted, and the whole mythology of the Trojan horse built up. And in practical ways, obviously, hiding a load of people in a ship would make much more sense than trying to actually the whole myth of the horse being put into the city. But anyway, I just thought that was a vaguely interesting tangential detail. Probably not, probably very dull. So, one of the issues about literacy, post-literacy, I'm not going to show you loads of images from the actual film. This is one of the few. But it strikes me that Matt Damon is an encapsulation of a therapy culture. So it's all about, the overall film is all about him finding himself and coming to terms with trauma. And I'll give you various quotes from various critics who are arguing this is basically about PTSD, it's about the horrors of war, it's an anti-war film. Now that is a message, it's a theme, it's something that Nolan's, obviously entitled to pursue, but it is completely against the literary tradition of an epic, which relates to, as I'll show you shortly, the whole notion of what a hero is, and the relationship of the person experiencing the epic, hearing it, and their cultural heritage. And I'm going to talk about how what Nolan does at the end of the film is push you towards the future. There's a Hollywood happy ending. Whereas what the actual Greek culture of the time, the Homer's original epic, was all about was finally struggling to get back to your homeland, what the Germans would call Heimat. But you get back to your homeland, you get back to your hearth, you get back to your family, your roots, and that is what, and then you get the revenge that you want, which you can talk about later. But in the original, there's no sense of guilt, there's no sense of shame, there's just a sense of fulfillment, and the gods are totally behind Odysseus as he punishes everyone who's betrayed him behind his back while he was away. Nolan's film doesn't have that literary heritage. He uses the film as a Trojan horse to introduce a lot of modern values. And again, I'm not really judging, critics would call it woke ideology. Other people would say, oh, it's empathetic and it's good. That's not my point. It's not whether it's good or bad. It's the idea that the purpose of the original Homer's epic was to maintain links between the listener and their heritage and their past. It was a past-looking, backward-looking form of literacy. The spoken word that Homer then wrote down and codified into, all these competing spoken traditions into the one recognized variant of the story. But that is a unashamedly backward-looking. We're going to look in a second at a book called Homer, Poet of the Past. And what Nolan's done is turn that around and make the epic all about contemporary concerns. And that is significant because that undermines the role that literacy played, this change from the oral epic to the written epic of Homer. And I will argue it has wider significance, and I'll give you the specifics in a second. This may not sound like it matters at all, but actually it's crucial for what reading can give us and what modern society is losing by jettisoning this very uniquely specific literary way of thinking about the world. So just to give you very quick examples, in the actual Nolan film, he decaffeinates the sexual side of the relationship of Odysseus with Circe and Calypso. that isn't shown, portrayed, or even in the case of Cersei, it's not even intimated. Whereas he had carnal knowledge of both of these figures in the original, and that was part of the struggle to get home. nice struggle if you can get it. But in a way, Nolan's cancelled that. This idea that looking back, it is an aspect of cancel culture in the modern culture war. You don't acknowledge the type of history that used to exist. It's cancelled from consideration. And I don't think it's Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is portrayed as a cancel culture film. There was DEI controversies, and I'm deliberately avoiding all of that. But just the idea that he's actually part of, or the film can be perceived as part of this cancel culture, because it reverts, it takes away from this backward looking, this past, this unashamedly focus upon the past. And in the past, the sexual element was a key part of the story. The violence and the way in which the gods condoned the absolutely gut-wrenching violence at the end of the epic, that was all part of the cultural heritage. That was all part of what the epic was about. And it's interesting how Nolan has completely avoided that. He's chosen to elide it. And rather than the book being about sex and violence in the movie, it's much more about Matt Damon in the Odysseus role feeling trauma, suffering, and trying to, in a almost therapeutic way, find his way out. And that is a completely modern perspective that, just to repeat for the umpteenth time, goes against the literary tradition. And now I'll get into, well, what's the significance of this literary tradition I keep banging on about? So T.S. Eliot, in the use of poetry and the use of criticism, the chief use of the meaning of a poem in the ordinary sense may be to satisfy one habit of the reader, to keep his mind diverted and quiet while the poem does its work upon him, much as the imaginary burglar is always provided with a nice piece of meat for the house dog. So that's T.S. Eliot, and it's interesting. I think that was 1933 that was written. And then in 1964, Marshall McLuhan said, "For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind." So you can see how it's been adapted. And I like the way McLuhan's very succinct. It's a beautiful idea. The medium is the message. So we think the content of a film or a novel is the thing what we're being affected by. And what I want to explore in this and future videos is it's not so much the content. Of course, the content has meaning. I'm going to be talking about that. But also, the way in which you experience the content can be as important or more important than the content itself. So in a future video, I want to look at this. It's a wonderful book. Wilhelm Wöhringer, a theorist of art. And for the life, I should have written down, sorry, idiot me, when it was, I think it was like 1908, 1909. Apologies if I've completely misremembered. But early 1900s, and he wrote this book, Abstraction and Empathy. And it's a very interesting concept, because when you think of people like Pablo Picasso, he did Les Mademoiselles d'Avignon, and he used, it's been renamed, but at the time it was called the Trocadero Museum, I think, in Paris. And a lot of famous artists went there. It had an exhibition of primitive art from Africa and places. And that influenced some of the modernist artists, the cubists, and so on. And what Wöhringer argues in his book that I think is directly relevant, I'll explain how it all links together, but he argues that primitive art is abstract because threatened by the outside world, threatened by existence and just the confusion and the dangers of the external world, primitive peoples, as the cave paintings and things like that, or basic geometric shapes that they would carve on stone and so on. Primitive people practiced, ironically, abstract art that it took centuries for the West to imitate. You know, the beginning of the 20th century was when it really hit its peak. But so-called primitive people have been doing this for millennia. And he contrasts that with empathy. The empathetic approach is more when art is naturalistic. It's comfortable because scientific Western advanced cultures are comfortable with the external world. They're not scared like primitive people. They want to represent through their art the external reality as accurately as possible. And that he calls that the empathetic approach. But in reference to Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, it's interesting that all the DEI controversy and the way in which the film has been reframed as a film about trauma, the ultimate value being expressed there is empathy. Now, you can argue that's an incredibly positive thing. You could see it as more narcissistic empathy. Virtue signaling type would be one way of portraying it. But that notion of empathy, I think it's a really interesting argument that Voringer puts forward, is that modern art forms or modes of representation that try to be naturalistic and realistic, they actually are deeply rooted in the notion of empathy. So that, I think, introduces a really useful bridge to understanding how in a contemporary society that's engaged in the culture wars and empathy is a huge, big issue, how it might explain how these things end up in artistic representations like Nolan's film. But like I say, this is quite a complex, deep argument I will try and do a whole video on. But in practical terms, how is this empathy shown technologically? And this is the state. Forgive me, I know very little about technical issues, but my understanding was the early IMAX cameras are big and bulky and they made a hell of a lot of noise, and that affected the ability to film without ruining the dialogue. Whereas this is part of the new generation that are much smaller and quieter, while still maintaining 70mm film stock. And for non-English people, that's actually pronounced Keithley. And I know this because I used to travel into Leeds an awful lot, and there's a village outside Leeds, and the announcer always used to, whenever I'd arrive in Leeds, it was always the 12:10 from Keighley, and this was a name that I could never get out of my head the way it was said, Keighley, in a Yorkshire accent. But anyway, offending Yorkshire people now. But this idea that everything, the whole point of IMAX cinema, Stuart's talked about this on my channel in live streams, but the whole raison d'etre of IMAX is to get the most high resolution possible, to capture as much of reality as you can possibly get and immerse the viewer in that experience. So to link this back to the concept of empathy, this is Voringer again. The need for empathy can be looked upon as a presupposition of artistic volition, only where this artistic volition inclines toward the truths of organic life, that is, toward naturalism in the higher sense. So that's what I was it's convoluted language. That's what I was basically saying earlier about empathy being linked to a sense of naturalism. You can empathize with the external world if you see it related back to you in a highly realistic form. The sensation of happiness that is released in us by the reproduction of organically beautiful vitality, what modern man designates beauty, is a gratification of that inner need for self-activation in the presupposition of the process of empathy. Now this, again, apologies for it's all quite technical language, but this idea that what modern man designates beauty is a gratification of that inner need for self-activation. It's an interesting concept that what you think of as beautiful is actually, at a psychological level, self-centered. You get some fillip in your sense of being in the world through seeing something recognizably naturalistic that you then reinterpret as beautiful. And this is, yes, you're looking at something external to yourself, but it also, in a weird way, gives you some type of self-validation. And that leads to this notion of empathy. So in the culture war, when people accuse other parties of having an excess of empathy, it's like empathy has gone out of control. Everything has to be about tolerance, purportedly. This idea, it's just interesting to trace way back at the beginning of the 20th century, early 1900s, that you could argue this was the more art becomes naturalistic and got eventually, the form of art such as painting was overtaken by first photography, then cinema, that becomes more and more naturalistic. Voringer actually provides a way of thinking how this might create the grounds for a society that becomes pathologically obsessed with the concept of empathy. In the forms of the work of art we enjoy ourselves, aesthetic enjoyment is objectified self-enjoyment. The value of a line, of a form, consists for us in the value of the life that it holds for us. It holds its beauty only through our own vital feeling, which in some mysterious manner we project into it. So I'm going to do more material in future because I never used to like abstract art whatsoever. And I was one of those people, some of whom might be watching now, who would say, oh, abstract art, a 4-year-old could have done that. I really don't understand it at all. And the more I've read this type of stuff, I've understood the motivation behind it and the way in which this idea that it holds its beauty only through our own vital feeling, we project into it. It's gotten so what the non-abstract art, this is the corollary, non-abstract art that seeks to represent the world around us in a realistic, naturalistic way, that, as is being described here, risks becoming quite self-indulgent, whereas abstract art is constantly asking us to reflect upon the nature of the thing being represented, and they are two completely different ways of approaching art. And just to illustrate the point, I just think it's an amazing photo, but it's the absolutely stunningly beautiful Marilyn Monroe. And she was reading Ulysses. So the equivalent today, I'm trying to think, Kim Kardashian. I think I saw a photograph of one of the Kardashians reading War and Peace. But honestly, nowadays you can't tell whether it's an AI mock-up or not. But I loved this juxtaposition between, at the time, arguably the most beautiful woman in the world, and an example of modernist art, well, we'll get into this when I look at Ulysses in future. On the one hand, it is incredibly naturalistic. It describes in vivid, gory detail human functions. But on the other hand, it has this innate tension. The novel is incredibly abstract. It has an underlying structure, a schema that Joyce superimposed after the event almost. But it mimics to some extent the pattern of the Odyssey. But you just wonder whether, nowadays there'd probably be a film version. I'm surprised there has been an old film of Ulysses, but I'm surprised that might be Christopher Nolan's next one. An AI-generated Marilyn Monroe becomes Molly Bloom. I wouldn't put it past him. But why I'm just showing this, not because I just want to look at Marilyn Monroe in a bathing costume, but it's more to do with that's another reason, but it's more to do with the idea that this overwhelming temptation in a photographic, filmic society to try and impose beauty on, even in this instance, on a novel that is all about the relationship between the abstract and the naturalistic. And it may or may not be beautiful, but that's not the point of James Joyce's Ulysses. It's incredibly challenging, and the beauty is not the overt physical beauty of someone like Marilyn Monroe. So it's just this, I just find it just an intriguing photograph for the different values being expressed, contained within it. So this is something else I'll be looking at in future. I like this guy's work, Jacques Ellul, who I think his most famous book was The Technological Society, I think it was called. But this is from a 1985. He's dead now, but this is later on in his career, The Humiliation of the Word. At this point, we come to the greatest mutation known to humankind since the Stone Age. The delicate balance between seeing and hearing, word and gesture, was broken in favour of signals and sight. Western people no longer hear. Everything is grasped by sight. They no longer speak, they show. Nevertheless, we are inclined to consider contempt of discourse, the hatred of the word and language that has gripped us so, as a problem only for intellectuals. Now, on the most basic level, in terms of literacy, this is quite a strong claim, but it fits with my idea that we're living in a post-literate age. But this notion, Western people no longer hear. It's a routine argument against Nolan films that A, the dialogue isn't very good, it's badly written. So in the Odyssey, the recent film, Matt Damon's running at the head of a battle and he shouts, "Let's go." There's the, repeated, many people have made the observation that, I want my daddy back. So there's the use of the word daddy. There's the F-bomb is used, I think, 3 times in the film. So Western people no longer hear. I think Christopher Nolan's quite a good example for some otherwise brilliant filmmaker who doesn't seem to put an awful lot of film stock, by dialogue or the importance of language. And you've got this, we'll talk about this notion of singing in a second, but I used the epigraph at the beginning, the Travis Scott character, the rapper at the beginning of the whole film. And at the end, it's referenced again. Nolan almost tips his hat to the idea that writing has had its day, and now it's the age of song again. They no longer speak, they show. Well, that goes back to the Keith Lee IMAX camera I just showed you. So it's only about a week or so ago at the time of filming this. So this is, I've lost track of the date, but this is mid-July. About a week ago, 2026, though, and when it says August, this was an article published ahead of time. So I haven't lost basic mathematical ability, but before this August edition, it's been pre-published. This Rose Horowitz, she's been on US television and NPR and things like that, as you can see from this NPR interview. But she makes statements like, optimists once believed that universal literacy was inevitable. Now it seems that the age of reading might be a short anomaly in human history. And then, as evidence, in America, the share of people who read a book or even an article on any given day has declined by 40% in the past 2 decades. And currently, gambling is a more popular leisure activity than reading is. And she's very earnest. She's got very big eyes, dark eyes, and she's describing, and she does it in, obviously she's a journalist, but she does it in a very accessible way. And she has this argument, the title of the actual article is "The End of Reading is Here." And just to underline and repeat, of course people are, as I said, there's more literacy in the terms of basic literacy, but reading something complex. I witnessed this firsthand in the university sector, students being unwilling or unable to read whole books. And I remember seeing interviews by Oxbridge dons in English literature who can no longer put on their course lists large numbers of actual books. They have to increasingly give excerpts. They can't assign longer books. And I'm just to give you an example, when I did undergrad, I did a outside course in my, was it second year at Edinburgh? And it was a year-long course, one of the courses I did, and it was 19th century Russian studies. So half of the course was history, and the other half of the course was literature. And in that one half of the course, we did basically all the highlights of 19th century Russian literature. So there's a lot of reading, but including War and Peace, Anna Karenina, 2 or 3 Dostoevsky books, and Goncharov, Oblomov, Gogol. It was, and it didn't at the time. It didn't seem overwhelming because that's what was expected. I went to America and in my 3rd year and did a course on Tolstoy, and we did Anna Karenina and War and Peace in a semester. Now, I honestly don't think that happens today. It's not that students are any more stupid than they used to be, but the expectations and the culture in which they live are increasingly anti-literate. I just can't help but come to that conclusion. Now, to get into the nitty-gritty of why this matters, this is a brilliant book that looks at the concept of how Homer was a poet who focused his efforts on maintaining links with the past. And one of the interesting things is that the epigraph I gave you about all people will have now, the Travis Scott thing, all people will have now are songs of the, and to remember the people who wrote. I'm going to now look at what was actually meant by Nolan's using the word singing, and he uses a rap artist as the singer. The bards who recited the epics were known as singers, but Andrew Ford goes out of his way to show how that it wasn't singing as we know it, and it wasn't poetry as we know it. And this is one of the things I think passes most people by. The profoundly different way that text is treated today than it was in the past. So he says, for centuries before this, he's talking about the transcription from the oral spoken Homer's epics to the written form. So for centuries before this transcription took place, and we're not sure whether it was in the 8th century or the 6th, or whether a master poet wrote it himself or dictated it, or stood in line to give his contribution before some tyrant's art committee. That's what would happen today. The sum and substance of these poems and of all their antecedents, variants, and sequels were only a series of changing oral performances by many singers in many parts of Greece. It's not difficult to conceive that the very idea of poetry may have been profoundly different in a milieu where stable texts were never the primary and definitive form of a song, and where each performer presented himself only as the spokesman of a tradition and not as an artistically gifted individual. Now, I've emboldened that because it strikes me, for good or bad, the whole hoopla around Christopher Nolan is definitely the latter and not the former in that phrase there, in that sentence. He's talking about what he's going to do in the rest of his book. This is near the beginning of the book. I take a close look at the traditional word for what a poet does, singing, Oddity. Singing may seem so natural an expression for this art as to be hardly significant, but the etymology of Oddity, supported by a number of texts, leads me to explore its relation to a word for the human voice, ode, which is where we get auditory and audio and all those type of words. The trope of singing as voicing suggests tensions between reducing poetry to substance, the timbre and volume of the oral poet's voice as his instrument, and allowing it to dematerialize into meaning, voice as an expression of thought. The epithet common to the poet's singing and voice is thespis, God-spoken, the near contradiction of an art of a God-spoken human voicing. So he's pointing to the tension just before all of this was written down and attributed to Homer, the oral tradition of these things being recited. He's pointing out there was a tension between the actual voice of the poet and the meaning of what was being said. So we're back to McLuhan's idea of the meaning and the medium. But also to link this, I'm trying to link all these things together, but the Voringer, the idea of the abstract and the empathetic, that just the human voice alone expressing thought is a very, if you think about it, yes, it can be, it's very immersive, but it's quite abstract, it's quite limited. This isn't IMAX, this is just the human voice engaging with what we'll see is described as an incantation. Albert Lord was a writer in this area that Ford's describing. Albert Lord suggested that our very conception of poetry as literature is completely alien to Homer's milieu. The traditional oral epic singer is not an artist, he's a seer, like a prophet, a forecaster. The patterns of thought that he has inherited came into being to serve not art, but religion in its most basic sense. His balance, his antitheses, his similes and metaphors, his repetitions, and his sometimes seemingly willful playing with words, with morphology and with phonology, were not intended to be devices and conventions of Parnassus, Mount Parnassus was the home of the Muses, or the mythical home of the Muses, and I think physically Delphi was situated there, but were techniques for emphasis of the potent symbol. Art appropriated the forms of oral narrative. So it's the two sections I've emboldened. He's not an artist, he's a seer. It sounds like Monty Python. He's not Jesus Christ, he's a very naughty boy. He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. Anyway, he's not an artist, he's a seer. Again, not exactly the way, well, maybe Christopher Nolan, the way he's viewed today is he's combined the two. He seemed to be this prophet-like auteur. But he's advocating that what we now no longer experience, it goes back to this idea that Voringer was saying about us trying to imitate the Greeks, we'd be like apes. Because for them, this was a religious incantation. And think about how far away the IMAX experience is from a religious incantation. It's the height of commerciality instead. But were techniques for emphasis of the potent symbol. The potent symbol here refers to, in Greek religious culture, the gods, the potent symbol was anything that was used to portray a sense of the essence of a deity or a god. It's the encapsulation of the divine essence. And we have some aspect of that, I suppose, when we talk about having an epiphany, an epiphanic moment when you have an experience of art. The point I think Ford makes and Nietzsche makes when he talks about the birth of tragedy in ancient Greece, this religious epiphanic aspect of art was baked in. It wasn't art as we know it, which sounds like something from Star Trek, but it was actually a form of religion. In some sense, epic reanimates the heroes, restoring them to action and speech. For the poet's voicing retains some magical power, even as it retains some of its magical taboos. Naming was invocatory, and not naming was apotropaic. Apotropaic is the idea it's warding off evil. So it's like having, for example, an image of an eye to ward off the evil eye, which I think in Greece and Turkey today they still have. From this point of view, each utterance is of equal value, for the opposition at work here is simply saying against not saying, naming or refusing to name. The briefest mention of the death of the most marginal character evokes that fact and preserves its fame to the same degree as the fullest and most poignant account of the fall of a Hector or a Patroclus. The corded bedstead, the smooth thole pin are retrieved from oblivion by poetry no less than the shield of Achilles or the palace of Menelaus. So the corded bedstead, I actually think in the original there's a misprint in this book. It's the cordoned bedstead, but it should be the corded bedstead. It's mentioned in, is it book 1 of the Odyssey? Telemachus goes to bed and it's described as a corded bedstead. It just means that there's leather thongs are used in order to put some type of mattress, basic mattress. So it's not exactly modern spring bed, but it's their version. And the fold pin is it's what the oar is pinioned on in a rowboat. So the point Ford's making is just these little tiny details of life in ancient Greece. In the recited oral poem, they have the same status. They're helping to create in granular detail this notion of immersive reality that's being expressed in the story. The poet's picture of song is very different from that constructed by the critic. A reader who selects central themes or episodes from the whole neglects the power inherent in each thing. An inventory of every third item or only of gold-plated items will be a totally different kind of inventory. To transform the song into an artistic structure is a distortion of this aspect of its nature. It is not a poem to be read into, not a coded message to be deciphered, not an artifact to be appreciated in aesthetic contemplation. As a form of Aude, singing was finally sound and not the stored up structure of a song. So this broaches on the issue of immersion. I've seen quite a few reviews of Nolan's film in which it links the concept of anachronism, but basically people are saying that they're immersed technically by the wonderful camera quality of the filming, the detail, the skill of Nolan, but various aspects, the DEI hiring and all these type of things, pull you out of the anachronism of the boat, for example. All these things risk the plant pot helmets of the Spartan soldiers, things like that, pull you out of the immersive experience. But what's interesting in this, Andrew Ford's describing the original telling of the epic. It's not something to be aesthetically contemplated, whereas the Nolan film, irrespective of whether it's good or bad, you're sat there in, ideally, an IMAX cinema, being confronted by something to be contemplated, to be looked at. Whereas, despite the fact it's so much more basic, a bard just reciting a story, in a certain sense, it's incredibly more immersive. And it's a very abstract, pure thing. So, as a form of Aude, singing was finally sound and not the stored up structure of a song. So this is a chapter, there's a chapter in this book, which I'm trying to remember now. The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception is the name of the chapter, in which, in this book, Horkheimer and Adorno, they look at specifically the Odyssey, but specifically the episode of the Scylla and Charybdis. And I love this. This is a phrase, a sentence from this chapter. Works of art are ascetic and unashamed. So ascetic is like a hermit, self-denying. The culture industry is pornographic and prudish. So despite the fact I've described how in Homer's original spoken epic, the actual relationship of Odysseus to Circe and Calypso, there's repeated references to them falling into beds and enjoying each other, or euphemisms like that. So basically they're at it like rabbits. And it's interesting that Nolan doesn't go there. And that's interesting because this phrase implies that works of art are unashamed. So the work of art, Homer's original epic, deals with the threat to Odysseus's self-identity, the threat to his marriage, the seductive property, the temptation, the struggle required to come home to Ithaca. Whereas the culture industry is pornographic and prudish, the culture industry shows you everything. Pornography being just the extreme example of the visual focus. But it's prudish. Like Nolan, in this instance, Nolan avoids the implications that Odysseus was sleeping with Circe and Calypso. And what else? The violence. So there's violent fight scenes at the denouement of the film, but you don't see the servant girls. Was it 12 or 15? But there's, let's say, 12. And they're executed, they're hung on one cable, and it's an ignominious end and incredibly painful, and it's described in detail. That's spoken of in the oral epic that is limited technologically. It's just the human voice is telling you all this. Whereas the thing designed to show you everything, the Keithley IMAX camera, Nolan avoids going there. But I love this. This is a section. So again, all these things I want to do in future, but I want to do this chapter. So Adorno and Horkheimer say, Book 12 of the Odyssey tells how Odysseus sailed past the sirens. Their allurement is that of losing oneself in the past, but the hero exposed to it has come of age and suffering. In the multitude of mortal dangers which he has had to endure, the unity of his own life, the identity of the person have been hardened. The realms of time have been separated for him, like water, earth, and air. The tide of what has been has receded from the rock of the present, and the future lies veiled in cloud on the horizon. So the interesting line, and this is something I have to spend much longer on in future, but the line that Horkheimer and Adorno are taking is that despite the fact, as I've been saying, the spoken epic of Homer is all about maintaining ties with the past, there's seeds of the modern tendency to live in the present and look to the future in the figure of Odysseus. So the classic example of this is when he's tempted by the sirens. It's a beautiful example Horkheimer and Adorno give. They describe how Odysseus ties himself to the mast. The ears of the rowers of his crew are waxed up so they can't hear anything. And they say this is like a metaphor for capitalist owners get to enjoy the fruits of the song, whereas the workers have to be distracted and they can't enjoy the song, they just have to get on with working. And they just go into this whole analysis of what the Odyssey represents in terms of the development of Western society. It's brilliant stuff. But this, you can see what I've emboldened. This is moving away from what Andrew Ford is saying about the focus upon the past. At least Adorno and Horkheimer's interpretation is the seeds of change are already in the Odyssey. And maybe this is part of it being written down, as opposed to the things Andrew Ford are talking about was the oral epic, the spoken word. And that this notion of veiled in cloud on the horizon, at the very end of the film, which I'll talk about in a second, they change the end from Homer's original. And rather than the gods being pleased, they're still chuffed with, that's a good English, Northern English expression, chuffed, happy, pleased with. The gods are chuffed with Odysseus's cunning and the way he's managed to get himself home, and they completely forgive him of the slaughter. They stop the families of the slaughtered men retaliating, and everything's tickety-boo. he has to go off and do one final sacrifice for Poseidon, but he's home free, and I'll talk about the prophecy of Tiresias. As long as he makes the sacrifice to Poseidon, he'll live a long life and die of old age. In his own environment, in his homeland, he couldn't be more rooted in his own cultural tradition, whereas Nolan takes Penelope and Odysseus off into the sunset. Classic Hollywood ending. So now I'm just going to finish off with some references to various people who've done reviews that I thought were quite insightful. So rather than hear my jaundiced views on Nolan, this is Natasha O'Neill in that famous intellectual journal Vanity Fair. Part of what makes the Odyssey both challenging and fascinating for a modern audience is that the titular character can never be pinned down, and that despite being the story's hero, he isn't a moral man. Homer's Odysseus is a shape-shifting trickster. His capacity for transforming himself to suit his circumstances is what makes him remarkable. Sometimes his tricks are strategic, but other times he seems to lie for the sake of lying. Excuse me. Much of his charm and admiration from the gods stems from his endless ability to spin a yarn. Yet in his film, Nolan almost completely does away with Odysseus the trickster. In its place, he weaves a more sombre story that combines classical themes of glory and homecoming with contemporary concerns about immigration, military aggression, and what civility looks like in a diverse and connected world. In other words, while some of the actual magic is lost, unlike in the poem, we never see Zendaya's Athena appear to Odysseus' son Telemachus as an old man, then shoot into the sky and transform into an owl. A shame for both us and Tom Holland. Something else is gained. Well, I fundamentally disagree with that something else is gained. Personally, I just think he's detracting totally from the original in order to make the epic about the here and now, rather than the point of the epic being about the link, the almost religious link to your cultural heritage. So he's, to my mind, he's shoehorning in these contemporary concerns. For some people, that will be the strength of the film. But I just think there's some quite good writing here. Nolan's Calypso is less a love-struck captor and more a sympathetic therapist who's got good drugs. Odysseus eats the lotus flower she hands him, which he doesn't do in the original, and it's not from Calypso anyway. A narcotic plant Homer actually features in a different section of the poem, correct, which makes him forget his home. But one gets the sense that this Calypso isn't necessarily being malicious. No, just overly indulgent. The lotus serves a therapeutic purpose to mitigate Odysseus' traumatic memories. And when Odysseus does remember what he's trying to return to, Calypso willingly lets him go. Whereas in the original, she's a lot more frustrated and resistant. But it is interesting, in the original, Odysseus doesn't eat the lotus plants. His crew do. He shows self-restraint. But this is a great... I've been doing stuff on the channel on Thomas Sars and about the over-medicalization of psychological issues. And this is the notion of Calypso being a drug-purveying psychiatrist almost. I find quite apt. Homer's Odyssey has an attraction to some of these fantastical creatures. Xenophilia. He becomes a lover to the nymphs Calypso and Circe and predictably finds the siren's call alluring. But Homer's text also contains a deep anxiety that by going native and entangling himself with these exotic females who live by a separate, less patriarchal code than their human counterparts, Odysseus might allow himself to be consumed, annihilating the identity seeking so hard to restore. It's another form of the age-old fear of being cannibalized by the other, something the Cyclops, the Lastrygonians, and the monster Scylla literally do to his men. So that's something else that Nolan reduces all this just to trauma. I think this is a very good point that Natasha O'Neill makes about the fear of being cannibalized by the other. There's a nuance and a depth to the original that's skated over in Nolan's version. So this is a different writer, John Byron Cooner. It's an interesting compact magazine. He doesn't quite, not amusing. Well, it's funny in bits, but this notion of white guilt. When he arrives home, he tells Penelope, while still in disguise, about how hard it is for a soldier to come back home, how he felt that he had destroyed his own home when he destroyed others. He applies this to explain how long it took Odysseus to come home. What if he knew what he had done? Odysseus takes the long road home because he feels guilty. He then speaks of the Trojan horse, specifically as a mistake. So the gods and everyone else in that time period would have found the Trojan horse an absolute stroke of genius, all fair in love and war. And it's fascinating that Nolan sees or portrays the Trojan horse as a mistake. And Odysseus is traumatized by this supposed mistake. And this goes to the issue of when you adapt something, yes, you can't do the whole of the epic in a 3-hour limitation of an IMAX film stock capability. So an adaptation is always going to be an adaptation. But I'm more interested in these type of deliberate, profound 180-degree alterations and what they reflect about the current zeitgeist. And this is interesting. That's the first line in Greek of the Iliad. And the first word is menin, wrath or rage. So although the English translation is sing, again with the singing, sing goddess, but in the Greek the word order starts with menin, the wrath, the rage of Achilles. So if you wanted any doubt that Homer's epics weren't about sensitive, navel-gazing men, I just love the way the Iliad starts with the word rage. I like this point. I think it's really good. Here the thematic connection with Nolan's previous film Oppenheimer becomes clear. Odysseus is the Oppenheimer of ancient Greece, the man who designed the weapon that ended the war, but also led to the deaths of thousands of innocents. He finds himself lost afterwards. He has supposedly achieved something great, yet he is racked with guilt. Athena appears as a manifestation of his conscience. He sees her being decapitated in the sack of Troy, and it appears she wishes him to give up his striving, lying, manipulating and fighting ways. As I've pointed out, the actual goddess Athena and the gods in the original epic are all on Team Odysseus. They're all supporting his cunning. This is the traumatic hallucination of Nolan's Odysseus, which is all about guilt and shame, the complete opposite. The nadir of Nolanization occurs after Odysseus is shipwrecked on the island of Calypso, Charlize Theron. It's like the Beatles coming to India. He wears hemp clothing. He does a lot of Lotus, a drug that helps him forget. He gets some eat, pray, love advice from Charlize, who never seems to be anyone other than Charlize. He has to let go, so he does. He lets go. He builds a raft. In Homer, this is 4 days of skilled craft with an axe, dropping 20 old trees and binding them together. But the love raft is some sticks and planks and a lot of letting go. He gets on the raft, does absolutely nothing, and when he wakes up again, he's lying on his back, raftless, back home on Ithaca. So it's the shortcut. Homer carefully begins Odysseus' journey on Calypso's island, where he lives with a beautiful goddess and has no responsibilities, yet is still unhappy, and ends it on Ithaca, where everything is a struggle and a responsibility, but that is where true satisfaction resides. Nolan's come to a different conclusion, however. It was a mistake to go to Troy. It was a mistake to win that war, and being king of Ithaca is not worth the responsibility. It's like the Liverpool phrase, it's not worth it. So Nolan ends the film with Odysseus and Penelope leaving. Again, profoundly different. And I'm arguing, I hope it doesn't seem too much of a stretch, but Nolan's chosen ending is much more true to Hollywood values than it is to the whole purpose of the oral epic that turned into a written epic. And in that sense, this idea about all you'll be left with is singers, that's all you'll have left to remember those of us who wrote. So heroes aren't writing their own histories anymore. They're feeling shame and feeling traumatized and suffering from PTSD. And just to show you the difference, this is the end. This is book 11. And I wanted to give you the contrast between the actual end. This is the end predicted by Tiresias if he does everything that he's told. And at the very end of the book, in book 24, Odysseus tells Penelope almost word for word what Tiresias predicted, so that he has to leave once more. And it's not Penelope and him leaving together. So this is Tiresias to Odysseus. You and your crew may still reach home, suffering all the way. If you only have the power to curb their wild desire and curb your own. What's more, from the day your good trim vessel first puts in at Thrinacia Island, flees the cruel blue sea, there you'll find them grazing, herds and fat flocks, the cattle of Helios. Warning. God of the sun who sees all, hears all things. Leave the beasts unharmed. Your mind set on home, and you may still reach Ithaca, bent with hardship true, but harm them in any way, and I can see it now, your ship destroyed and your men destroyed as well. And this is something about the epic. I think modern readers find Homer cruel, and yet at the very beginning of the whole story, Telemachus seeks legal redress from the suitors. He goes to the assembly and asks them to stop. And in this, Odysseus is warned. And this proves the warning isn't taken up by the crewmen. So what I like is, when people suffer terrible consequences, they can't say they haven't been told. But the contemporary attitude seems to be, oh, well, all punishment and all consequences are wrong, even if you've been told in advance. And I think that just takes away human autonomy and human responsibility. But anyway, I'm going to go on a rant. And even if you escape, you'll come home late and come a broken man, all shipmates lost, alone in a stranger's ship. And you will find a world of pain at home. Crude, arrogant men devouring all your goods, courting your noble wife, offering gifts to win her. No doubt you will pay them back in blood when you come home. But once you've killed these suitors in your halls by stealth or in open flight with slashing bronze, go forth once more. You must carry your well-planed oar until you come to a race of people who know nothing of the sea, whose food is never seasoned with salt, strangers all to ships with their crimson prows, and long slim oars, wings that make ships fly. So the idea is he's being told to go so far inland and make a sacrifice for Poseidon, god of the sea. So effectively, he's expanding the amount of the world that I've heard of Poseidon. He's expanding Poseidon's domain. And here is your sign, unmistakable but clear, so clear that you cannot miss it. When another traveller falls in with you and calls that weight across your shoulder, a fan to winnow grain, in other words, they don't know what an oar is, then plant your bladed, balanced oar in the earth and sacrifice fine beasts to the Lord God of the sea, Poseidon, a ram, a bull, and a ramping wild boar. Then journey home and render noble offerings up to the deathless gods who rule the vaulting skies, to all the gods in order. And at last your own death will steal upon you, a gentle, painless death. Far from the sea it comes to take you down, borne down with the years in ripe old age, with all your people there, in blessed peace around you. So that's the fate if he does what he's told, if he makes the appropriate sacrifice. but not for Nolan. Telemachus, Tom Holland, is left as king of Ithaca. Nolan has given us no confidence that this will result in anything good. Homer allows him to develop into a hero. He's capable of stringing his father's bow by the end, and he fights effectively at his father's side against the suitors. Nolan strips him of these accomplishments. Telemachus will wear the crown, which means there will be no empire anymore. Culture will die. Odysseus himself says of the rap musicians he leaves behind in his hall, songs will be all they have to remember those of us who could write, which is what I started with the epigraph. It doesn't take much squinting to recognise the film as a companion piece to Oppenheimer, so this is someone else saying it, or even a sequel. Both star great men who are lionised for their brilliance and ability to win gruelling wars, but the consequences of that victory are devastating and world-ending. That is literally so in the case of Oppenheimer, even if no one has pushed the red button since 1945. But in this new Odyssey, the Trojan Horse and subsequent sacking of a civilization shamed the Greeks, making them crueler and more savage than when they left their homes 10 years prior. It is rather awkwardly posited by Odysseus to Penelope that the horse alone turbocharged the fall of their Mycenaean world. So this is the remaking by Nolan, the sense of guilt. And it's the classic contrast. Homer was writing about a society of honour, and what Nolan is portrayed as a society of guilt and shame. But it begs the question, who are the barbarians? Nolan's presenting, he's basically saying the Trojan horse that led to the fall of Troy is actually the Trojan horse that led to the psychological trauma and the sense of guilt and the decline of the Greeks. So he's making quite a profound claim. My claim, I'm going one further. I'm seeing his claim that the barbarians were created by the use of the Trojan horse. And I would say that Christopher Nolan is representing the barbarian value through his misuse of the Trojan horse. That Trojan horse becomes a Trojan horse for barbarians like him who are undermining the literacy and urging us faster and faster into a post-literate age in the guise of presenting these values that run counter to the whole purpose of Homer's original epic. So the idea that I would accuse Christopher Nolan of being the true barbarian, I'll finish off with one of my favourite poems after I've looked at this Jean Baudrillard quote, because the implications of what I've just said. So if we go to this portrayal of the guilt felt, this is what, in Christopher Nolan's version, this is what makes Matt Damon so, the feeling of guilt and shame. And I think Jean Baudrillard, in an essay he wrote, actually, I think, portrays the counter-argument to this beautifully. So in the same way, on the pretext of unconditional respect for life, what could be more politically correct? We have heard the following humanitarian profession of faith pronounced: no idea in the world is worth killing for, nor, doubtless, worth dying for. No human being deserves to be killed for anything whatsoever. A final acknowledgement of insignificance, both of ideas and of people. This statement, which actually seeks to show the greatest respect for life, attests only to a contempt and an indifference for ideas and for life. Worse than the desire to destroy life is this refusal to risk it, nothing being worth the trouble of being sacrificed. This is truly the worst offence, the worst affront possible. It's the fundamental proposition of nihilism. So that's Baudrillard. I would apply that to Christopher Nolan. But now we get to, I jumped ahead, now we get to the poem, and I think it sums up my previous point about Christopher Nolan being the post-literate barbarian, and the point being expressed by Baudrillard here. So it's waiting for the barbarian, C.P. Cavafy. What are we waiting for assembled in the forum? The barbarians are due here today. Why isn't anything going on in the Senate? Why are the senators sitting there without legislating? Because the barbarians are coming today. What's the point of the senators making laws now? Once the barbarians are here, they'll do the legislating. Why did our emperor get up so early, and why is he sitting enthroned at the city's main gate, in state, wearing the crown? Because the barbarians are coming today, and the emperor's waiting to receive their leader. He's even got a scroll to give him, loaded with titles, with imposing names. Why have our two consuls and praetors come out today wearing their scarlet togas? Why have they put on bracelets with so many amethysts, rings sparkling with magnificent emeralds? Why are they carrying elegant canes, beautifully worked in silver and gold? Because the barbarians are coming today, and things like that dazzle the barbarians. Why don't our distinguished orators turn up as usual to make their speeches, say what they have to say? Because the barbarians are coming today, and they're bored by rhetoric and public speaking. Why this sudden bewilderment, this confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home lost in thought. Because night has fallen and the barbarians haven't come. And some of our men, just in from the border, say there are no barbarians any longer. Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were kind of a solution. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. The end of that poem makes me think that perhaps the barbarians are already within the gates, and the Trojan Horse is a double bluff. The Trojan Horse is actually the story about a Trojan horse represented by Christopher Nolan in the guise of empathy. But as Voringer, I quoted from him, arguably empathy needs a corrective dose of abstraction, the abstraction you find in literacy and the spoken and written word that we're increasingly in need of. So, till the next time, all the very best, take care.